Hello, Hellions, and welcome to Module 11. This is your last module with new content, so congratulations on making it through the deep waters. We are now in the 18th century, having jumped a couple from Shakespeare. Notice how modern that feels, 18th century after the depths of history we've been plumbing. And the subject of today's lesson is the beginning of the rules for English. Now, English has always had unspoken, unwritten rules, just passed down as convention and habit from speaker to speaker. But the idea that there were books in which people who were endowed with the authority to declaim such things dictated the correct English and separated it from the incorrect English, that is only a couple of 100 years old as a concept, which means that the individual rules that you have A, either been plagued by, or B, have been a sort of cherished enforcer of, are really only rather recent conventions. In fact, the whole project's rather new. But before we get to the beginning of rules, we're approaching the end of hell, and that calls for some fun and some celebration and some play in the spirit of Shakespeare. So let's play a bit first in the sandbox of language, and we'll play in the terms of a couple of contests. I'll announce them now. There will be points for them, and there will be winners with even more points and elaborate gifts and prizes and honor and glory in the unit project Beyond. First of all, I do love the Washington Post. It has a game contest that it's run for many years. You might have heard of it. It went around in emails for a while. They run a game where you supply a new definition for an existing word. And you want to use your hell skills and some spurious etymology and some re-bracketing and all of those fun language tools to come up with new words. Here are some past winning entries. Cough-e, a person who's coughed upon. Flabbergasted, appalled over how much weight you've gained. Abdicate, to give up all hope of ever having a flat stomach. Some of these have real poignancy, don't they? Negligent, a condition in which you absent-mindedly answer the door in your nightie. And lymph, which I cannot explain, but I love to walk with a lisp. And I'll invite you to play that game, supply a new definition for an existing word, but I'll also ask you to play the Change a Letter game, a second Wall Street Post game where you take an existing word, you add or subtract or change one letter and supply a new definition. So this calls for some sort of random variable thinking. What could you transform old words into? Past winners include reincarnation, coming back to life as a hillbilly. Vaseball. Yeah, that's kind of Brady Bunch fun. Giraffiti. Vandalism sprayed very, very high. Love that. Sarcasm. This just needs to write out and out be a word. The gulf between the author of sarcastic wit and the person who doesn't get it. Inoculate. Coffee intravenously when you're running late. See? Clever. So, to motivate you and get your creative juices flowing through your brain synapses, here are some winners from past years. Again, just offered to you for celebration, kickback. You've worked hard this semester. Let's just have some fun with language. I hope that's one of the abiding lessons of the course is rules and correctness and grammar. That's new stuff. But variety and play, that's the history of the English language. So let's play with some variety. Melancholy, a sad dog that only eats cantaloupe. Speaking of, cantaloupe, the inability to elope due to societal pressures for a traditional wedding. Defense, to surreptitiously steal your neighbor's fence. Yeah, it's kind of obvious, but I kind of like the image. Article, an unusually beautiful group of hanging points of ice. Kind of a combination or a portmanteau of two words. Particle, see the above, an article after someone has broken off a chunk of it. Transform, an application filled out only by transgendered persons. Timely. Telekinesis, emphasis on can, the act of a person overhearing their sister talking on the phone to another relative. Delight, to take bulbs out of lights. Again, obvious, but kind of tickles my fancy. and dumbfounded, finding out that one's IQ is not what they once thought it was. I have more. Stipendous, the mental state upon receiving a paycheck or stipend, from stupendous. Orthogonal, that takes orthogonal and gyne as in gynecology, Greek for woman, being perpendicular to one's wife. Shakespeare would have loved that. Televandalism, the use of television to encourage destructive behavior, like televangelist. Visceral, which is a stomach kind of gut reaction. Visceral, the sensation one gets when eating a delightful sugary cereal, making him or her so overcome with emotion, they can no longer make logical, healthy breakfast decisions. Normans, topical. Men who invaded England in 1066 and expected their native language to be the norm. Hey, hey, hey. Shows me you're paying attention. I like that. Superfluous. This was very popular one year. The heavy day of a woman's menstrual period. Superfluous. Extra. Unneeded. Artificial. Appearing to have had plastic surgery on the face. Awkward, an ill-fitting word. Some of these just need to be shoved into the LED. Brattle, to tattle, as a younger sibling, a brat. Mystery, an enigmatic male. Peripathetic. Boy, I might have to explain this one so much. Peripathetic is from Greek for walking around. It is a school applied to the followers of Aristotle, who were literally the followers of Aristotle because he would walk in lecture and they would follow behind him and listen and write. So Aristotle's school is the peripatetic school. This is peripathetic, approaching pitifulness. I have more. Diarrhea, a journal of bowel movements. Tanorexia. You figure that out yourself. Scintillating without the C, a brilliant, lively, or witty offense against God. Unicorn. Actually, that belongs in the other contest. An asexual breed of corn that is considered to be mythical plant by modern corn. I like that whole mythology there. Radar. Heightened sense of hearing that resident assistants have to determine who is being loud after quiet hours. And my favorite of all, I used it yesterday in a normal sentence, mortifried. To be so severely and vexingly embarrassed as to become fried to a crisp. Yes! Pedigreed. The desire to collect for oneself an inordinate number of feet. I love the ped puns, right? Massacra. Oh, I have attributions for these. You can figure out who wrote them. Obvious meaning. Someone used me, Kensack, defending oneself through the firing of Ken dolls. As in he Ken-sacked Troy. It's stretching, but I appreciate the effort. Optimist. You gotta go with this one. Fog comprised of millions of tiny eyeballs. From Optimist. Stephen King, kind of. Crematorium. It's a milk museum. Yay. Whimsical. An impromptu musical. Done on a whim. Nice. All right. Stop having fun. It's time to learn things. So, 18th century. I say 18th century, you say Enlightenment. I say 18th century, you say Age of Reason. I say 18th century, you say that which preceded the 19th century, which is associated with romanticism and emotion and Wordsworth and Coleridge and Byron. But this is the 18th century of Swift and of Pope and of Dr. Johnson and of Diderot and the first encyclopedia. This is the age of Newton and of the scientific empirical method being discovered. And there's a you can't really do a whole zeitgeist of a century, but you know, it's a good starting point to get oriented in history. So an overarching sort of desire to reduce human life, which is messy, and human conventions to logical systems is a bit of the spirit of the age, if there is one of those. Scientific rationalism and philosophy, admiration for mathematics and logic, emulation of Latin and Greek, where the scientists are getting the names for anatomical parts, physiological processes, dinosaurs. Latin and Greek were considered perfect, both because of the kind of Renaissance fascination with the classical antiquity, and also because, unlike modern languages, classical Latin and classical Greek are dead. Greek continues to evolve, but they're fixed. They're finished. They're not changing anymore, so you can study them as if they were a perfect system. And they had that that sort of perception in the 18th century that, wow, that is a language which is incorruptible and permanent. And a search for the universally true, absolute, timeless. Well, you take all those things and you apply them to language and you get grammar books. So, reason and language. This is actually when most of our grammar rules were written down, were sort of codified. For instance, you all know that if you say, I ain't got no sweater, that two ain'ts and two nots are like two negative ones. And what's negative one times negative one? It's positive one. Two negatives make a positive. So you really do have a sweater because that's math. That goes back to a guy, Robert Loth, 1762. Two negatives in English, I love this, destroy one another, or are equivalent to an affirmative. That's logical. You can't argue with the logic. If language were mathematics, he would absolutely be correct. The thing is, scientists didn't make up language. People did. And people are not rational. Anxiety over language change. And this I really do get, because I'm seeing my favorite authors move into illegibility because they used older forms of the language. There is a desire to stop language change. If you've learned one thing from McWhorter, it's that language changes. And to change is to be imperfect. God is unchanging. Platonic ideas are independent of human time and space and culture. They wanted to take language and make it this kind of perfect object which never changes anymore. Why? Suffer, as in allow. Remember that? Suffer the little children to come to me. And so he suffered them. Suffer not our Shakespeare, notice the spelling, and our Milton, Paradise Lost author, to become 2 or 3 centuries hence, he means us now, what Chaucer is at present, meaning you need footnotes. Well, or the study of only a few poring antiquarians. Hi, that's me. And in an age or two more after that, the victims of bookworms. In other words, we'll lose our great authors of English if we don't stop the language from changing. And the word they applied to that desire was ascertainment. And you want to focus on the root certain. They wanted to ascertain what the correct form was, and then they wanted to make everyone certain of it. It's like fixing the language in two senses. Correcting what's broken, bringing everyone to the same correct, true standard, and then fixing it in the sense of like putting a pin in it, stopping its change. And this all comes out this comes out of a group of people historically conditioned by a cultural period in time and its preoccupations. They wanted to apply like Latin and algebra to language. That's not something that's inevitable. Our way of thinking about language, which basically follows this line of thought, comes out of this historical period. They wanted a standard. So often they modeled the correct English you're supposed to use on Latin and Greek, with the mistaken notion that those were perfect languages. They seem perfect for one reason, because they're dead. Living languages change. There's no one around to change dead languages. You could also add in this is the era of nation building. Maybe you look at a globe and you think all those lines on the map are just there because they are there, because they're true. I hope eventually you have a good education in colonialism, the 1883-84 Berlin Accord, where 12 or so European nations decided how to carve up Africa. And so the nations of Africa, they're not things. They're not real. Those lines on Africa and Middle East is basically the same. They're simply the lines of sort of either where wars left, you own this, but I got to grab that, or they're the record of historical just land grabs. Europe grabbed this, Germany grabbed that, Portugal grabbed this, Belgium grabbed that in the Belgian Congo. These things were created, and they were only created in the last couple hundred years. Countries, most of them. Egypt goes back a fair ways. Language rules. What I'm doing is an act of deconstruction, taking something that maybe you think of as an absolute truth and saying, well, it has a history. and people came up with it. It's a human convention. And we are clouded by mysticism when we think of them as absolute realities. Two countries, neither of which was a real country yet, definitely not Italy, a bunch of city-states. France more so, but still divided, had what we call academies. So if you're going to determine a language standard, ascertain correct usage, and fix the language, who's going to do it? Well, they need to. The they was, in Italy, the Accademia della Crusca, which is way old, 1562, and in France, the even more successful Académie Française, founded by Cardinal Richelieu, of very important historical fame. These were groups of aristocratic men, largely. This is a male inheritance, simply because they were in power at the time. And they were highly educated, and they set themselves the task and built themselves lovely buildings to do it in, of purifying the language, judging style, and establishing correct usage. And so there was a continental, remember there's no America yet, there is a continental model in two places at least for fixing language. What about the English language? You know Jonathan Swift, he had a modest proposal. I think it had something to do with being kind to babies. Haven't read it in a while. But Anno of Gulliver's Travels, which is a lovely travel guide to the modern world, about how to get tied up by very small people and talk to horses and things like that. Jonathan Swift, one of the theys, right, proposed that England do the same, that we keep up with the Joneses in Italy and in France. And in 1712, he had a proposal. Man, that guy and his proposals. Like the guy at the library board meeting was like, and I have another proposal for the board. He proposed correcting, which is interesting. Think of that. English, Shakespeare was incorrect, or Chaucer was incorrect. Which one of Shakespeare's past tense verbs was incorrect? And improving, oh, really? Things were like poor and run down, and we're going to improve them, like a neighborhood renovation. And ascertaining, there's that word of determining and also fixing the English tongue. And just, you can't even talk about this stuff without being figurative. So notice the images and metaphors. And also, I haven't used this word yet, but you need to write it in large letters in your notes. Prescriptivism. This is the beginning of prescriptivism in language. That is, there are certain people who can prescribe, like a doctor who has command of medicine can prescribe a cure or a medicine. These people were prescribing correct language. So watch for images. My lord, this is his proposal, a swift proposal. I do here in the name of all the learned and polite persons of the nation. I love that, like we got together, the learned and polite persons. And I complain that our language is extremely imperfect compared to, that its daily improvements, Swift did recognize changes and that it added good things, scientific terms, that's probably good, are by no means in proportion to, that means less than, its daily corruptions. Wow, to corrupt a language. Did 1066 corrupt the language? Did the Anglo-Saxon conquest corrupt the language? Did Viking invasions corrupt the language? Well, if all of those things are corruptions, isn't language just a series of corruptions? What's the pure? What's the original if language is borrowing and change? There's often a flaw at the heart of 18th century scientific absolutism. In any case, so the language that the pretenders to polish, that's people who pretend to polish their shoes, the people who pretend to have social grace, polish, and refine it, have chiefly multiplied abuses and absurdities. So some people have tried to fix the language, but they were idiots. We're going to do it right. And that in many instances, it offends against every part of grammar. Imagine that. Grammar is, I don't know, I'm picturing some allegorical, maybe woman, very, very, very tall. Maybe she has scales or a gun in her hand, and she's offended by English grammar. And she wants it fixed, put right. No more Holpen versus Helped. Do it right. But what's right? Well, enter Dr. Johnson, rather. Samuel Johnson. David Brooks tells a wonderful story about him if you want to look it up. I know him as a poet, as the author of short daily dispatches for several magazine newspapers he wrote. Everything the man put his pen to is brilliant. He's the height of the brainiac 18th century. But he also was in the dictionary business. And here's what you want to think for Dr. Samuel Johnson. 1755, he writes a one-man OED. Think of that. It's a proto-OED, a first go. And whereas it took just dozens of editors and thousands of contributors to write the OED, and centuries, more than a century, Dr. Johnson essentially did this. He took 7 years after his education, and he walked into his room with, and in this period you could still get pretty much all the books that had ever been published, or at least the significant ones. And he walked into a room, closed the door, and 7 years later he walked back out of his room, having read everything ever written in English, give or take, and codified it, and collated it, and he wrote a 2,300-page book. That's 10 volumes at 230 pages each, with 42,000 entries. The thing weighed 21 pounds. That's like 2.5 stone English. His definition for take has 143 definitions that he was able to isolate himself in a room. And he actually started this idea of looking to the kind of great dead white European male tradition of authors for the correct usage. So many of his 114,000 quotes, can you even count to 114,000? Let alone gather that many quotations from Shakespeare, from Milton, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, Samson Agonistes. And he dated his historical examples. So that was like the OED, Samuel Johnson's dictionary, until the OED of the late 19th century and 20th century and ongoing. An astounding work. And that effort he put in comes out of the spirit of the age, that language is so important, that men of great discipline and intellect and training must sit down and fix it. 2 senses. Thing is, and I have an abridged version of his dictionary in my office if you want to come by and look at it. Great browsing, by the way, just great. Whenever that's done by one person or even a committee, what are you going to get? You're going to get absolute truth, especially in an area where there is no absolute truth or even truth. There's just what people say. You're going to get bias. We're going to learn a lot about the man. We're going to see the lens through which he looks at language. So let's look at some entries from Dr. Johnson's supposedly rational 1755 impressive dictionary and see if we can pick up some attitudes that reveal a personal bias. Oh, there it is, by the way. Long title. Back to Johnson. Some personal prejudices. See if you can tell which political party he belonged to. Definition of politician. 1. One versed in the arts of government. 1 skilled in politics. 2. A man of artifice. 1 of deep contrivance. And the 2 primary parties at his time, Tory and Whig. Tory, one who adheres to the ancient constitution of the state and to the apostolical hierarchy of the Church of England, opposed to a Whig. What is a Whig? That's the name of a faction. Any connotation going on there in his denoting? Favorite of all, you know about the English-Scottish wars and what it took to bring Scotland under basically British colonial rule in the United Kingdom, and what British think of Scottish people. All of that comes out in the word oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but which in Scotland appears to support the people. Ouch, zinger. Another term you need to know is Inkhorn Terms, because you know a lot of them if you're in college. An inkhorn is that which is up there. Remember that idea about some words which have fallen out of favor, bringing them back? And remember the idea about liking Latin and Greek roots? Well, an author in this period could simply dip his, occasionally her, pen into an inkhorn, inkwell we say, and then write out, using 2 or more Latin or Greek prefixes and roots, a new word, which is a Latin word, and make it just sound a little bit Englishy, and you've created a new word. In fact, most of the words you've probably learned in the upper levels of your education were Inkhorn terms. They didn't arise from the people. Someone made them up by pulling Latin or Greek straight into English. Many are 18th century creations, including these. Some have survived and some have not. Nidification, the act of building nests. Gemmelliparous, twin-bearing, both Greek. Oh dear. Ophiophagus, which is serpent eating. Now, don't you just need a word? Your world was not complete before you had a word for serpent eating, right? Mine certainly was. But that's just completely out of, Greek. The ophagus is interesting. We know it from, I'm just going to tangent off here into a word story. Pay attention, it's a cool one. You have one in the middle of your throat, an ophagus. What? An esophagus. Esophagus, phagein in Greek, refers to eating. Now here's your question. What's a sarcophagus? And why does it rhyme with esophagus? Well, sarx is the Greek word for corpse. So a sarcophagus, that's like a coffin. It's like a burial chamber. It's a corpse eater. That does make sense, because what happens to the corpse inside the sarcophagus? It goes away. It's eaten up by decay and time. Isn't that cool? But Ophiophagus, no kidding. I wouldn't have placed money that would last. Galericulate, covered as with a hat. Decacuminated, having the top cut off. These are straight from Latin and Greek. And urinator, we have those. No, that means a diver, an underwater searcher, like Jacques Cousteau, the urinator. More aerolation, assation, which we might be able to use, but not with that definition. Ataraxy, which sounds nothing like calmness. If you're like meditating, Zen, Om, and someone comes and says, "You doing some ataraxy?" I think you just break the spell. Clancular. Degladiation is sword fight, like a gladiola is a sword. Cubiculary is bedroom-like. What things are bedroom-like that are not bedrooms? Incompossible, unable to coexist. That could work in legal documents. And indigitate, to calculate with the fingers, like Chisenbop, which my mother taught me. And then we're going now to the ad absurdum level of extremes. Johnson being completely versed in Latin and Greek. That's just a given for an educated person in the 18th century. Would take a plain old English word and define it by using Latin words that probably none of you have ever heard of. This is the principle, by the way, of ignotum per ignotius. Ignotum, the unknown thing, like assuming you don't know the word nest or something. Per, that is through, explained through, the ignotius, which is a comparative form in Latin, the more unknown. So if you ever had an opportunity to explain something unknown using things even more unknown, I find myself doing it with my children all the time. So, using Inkhorn terms to define words using Latinate or Greek language. Cough. If you don't know what a cough is, maybe it will help you to know that it's a convulsion of the lungs velicated by some sharp serosity. You don't even have those words anymore. Reticulated. This is interesting. Something reticulated, a fabric, like a woven cloth is reticulated. Made of network, formed with interstitial vacuities, that is, empty spaces between the overlapping cross things. And of course, maybe you don't know what a network is. And a network is, and here we indulge in some wonderful circularity, anything reticulated or decussated at equal distances with interstices between the intersections. Now you know what a network is, right? He could also have a fun side, though, and a self-abrogating side, self-diminishing humor. A kickshaw, a dish so changed by the cookery that it can scarcely be known. I think we'd call that stir-fry, possibly. Patron. And remember, poets and even dictionary makers, they don't earn a living. They need a patron, someone to pay them to do their art or their scholarship, right? A patron is one who countenances, that is, allows, or supports, or protects. And commonly, generally, it is a wretch who supports you with insolence, rudeness, and is paid with flattery. Nice. Dull. Not exhilarating. Okay, fine. He gives an example, as in, to make dictionaries is dull work. Oh, he was a human being. And finally, lexicographer, which he was. Lexical word, graphe, right? A writer of dictionaries was just a harmless drudge, cog in the wheel, that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words. It's not sweet. Well, once he had finished his massive 20-pound dictionary, at the end of his life, he lost some faith in this whole idea of ascertaining the language, having given the biggest college try to it one could ever give. 7 years in a room with all of English literature. And he writes this. We laugh at that elixir, that alchemical magical potion, that promises to extend life to 1,000 years. And with equal justice, similarly, may the lexicographer be derided, laughed at, who, being able to produce no example of a nation that has preserved their words and phrases from mutability, change, listen to that, Robert of Gloucester, shall imagine that his dictionary can embalm his language. Laugh at the dictionary writer who thinks that his dictionary will embalm the language. He realizes that the only languages that change are dead languages. And secure it from corruption and decay, that it is in his power to change sublunary nature. They divided at the time, everything above the moon is unchanging. The moon has spots, though it's a heavenly body. So everything under the moon, this is the realm of change. This is, in fact, the realm of change. With this hope, however, academics have been instituted, academies, to guard, notice metaphors, the avenues of their languages, as if they were an intruder, to retain fugitives, words which want to leave, but we won't let them, because we're the they, and repulse intruders, words that want to force their way in. I have a dictionary of German, which is called Dictionary of Non-German Words Used in German. There's that same kind of xenophobic feeling that that's not one of our words. Well, centuries later, it's indistinguishable from the rest, but it can seem like immigrants pouring over the border, can't it? Who are but their vigilance and activity, that is, of the academies, have hitherto been vain, pointless. Sounds are too volatile, changeable, and subtle for legal restraints. To enchain syllables, to lash, tie down the wind of speaking, are equally the undertakings of pride, unwilling to measure its desires by its strength. The French language has visibly changed under the inspection of the Academy, and no Italian will maintain that the diction of any modern writer is not perceptibly different from that of Boccaccio in the 13th century. So have the Academies worked? No. The 18th century, however, also saw the other side of the argument, and thus the birth of what we recognize as modern linguistics, which is not about prescriptivism. That's middle school grammar teachers, prescriptivism. Descriptivism is the scientific nature of modern linguistics. Pause and hear that again. All modern linguists is descriptive. How do people speak? How do people write? Just like a biologist examining the activities of an ecosystem. How does it work? Not is it good or bad, right or wrong. And Joseph Priestley, who I think probably looked like the guy on the left, but maybe the guy on the right, is simply a recorder, an objective describer, a scientist of, not a lawgiver to. And so we get Priestley writing, with respect to customs laws and everything that is changeable, the body of a people, the we, not the they, who in this respect cannot but be free, you can't lash the wind, will certainly assert their liberty in making what innovations they judge to be expedient and useful. So, what's the standard? Well, the general prevailing custom, whatever it happens to be, can be the only standard for the time that it prevails. So, rejects the whole immutable ascertaining, fixing the language, and rejects the only Shakespeare and Milton can teach you how to speak right, because however people speak is the correct way for speaking at that time. He was joined by George Campbell, who says language is a species of fashion, think clothing that changes. It is not the business of grammar, as some preposterously imagine, to give law to the fashions of speech. No. From its conformity to these, and from that alone, it derives all its authority and value. For what is the grammar of any language? And here I'm pulling the rug out of a lot of your from your worldviews, because grammar is what we Englishy types love, the correct way to write and speak. But it is no other than a collection of general observations, methodically digested, and comprising all the modes previously and independently established, by which significations and combinations of words in that language are ascertained. In other words, language is like color fashion. It changes. You can record it, but you cannot dictate it. So who won? Swift and Johnson on the one side? This is a rather big point, so perk up your ears, cock your head to the side, listen carefully. Swift and Johnson, the prescriptivist, won the general population, and they won English majors and English teachers and some professors who see themselves as the lawgivers of language. I hate the phrase, have you corrected my English paper yet? I hate it. Do you know why? I know what you mean about, standard grammar and usage. I recognize that. I teach semicolons. Believe me, I write them in. But did you write the paper in order for me to make it correct? Did you write in order to write standard English? Or did you write to tell a story, to get a job, to influence politics, to record your secret thoughts for your diary? Why do we write? We don't write to use semicolons correctly. So I don't correct papers. I respond to papers. And if you need help in learning standard English, I'll help you do that, but not because it's good and true and the only correct way to use language, but because it is useful now. So that's not the whole story. Priestley and Campbell, who are the descriptivists, won linguists. And here I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say all linguists, 100.0 repeating % of linguists are scientists who describe how language is used in a given time and local place. I make the comparison to ornithologists. What ornithologist, that's a bird scientist, would ever go out and say, oh, that group of sparrows is speaking, bird calling, correctly, and that group of sparrows over there is calling incorrectly? That's just not what ornithologists do, right? The Audubon Society of Birds, they don't say this wing is good, this wing is bad. They say, look at all the wings. Look at all the bird calls. They describe them, they catalog them, they study them, they relish them for their variety. So, whereas Priestley and Campbell won the linguists, popular opinion and English departments remain stuck in the 18th century in their idea that there is one correct, true form of language. That was unthinkable in Chaucer's day, unimaginable in Beowulf's day, had he had a day. But in the last couple of hundred years only, we've been thoroughly convinced by 18th century voices that we use language in order to use it according to certain people's arbitrary standards for truth.